Hello, my name is Dr. Trish McClung, and I'm going to talk to you today about really what makes a good teacher and what makes a bad teacher. The official title would be Effective Instruction and Planning Lessons. So I want you just to spend a couple of minutes. You can talk to your neighbor or you can write it down in a list. I want you to list what you would think of as your worst teacher, and then I want you also to make a list of what you think the characteristics of your best teacher. So I'll just let you have a few minutes, a couple of seconds to write that down. And then I also would like it if you could talk to each other and say, this was my best teacher, this is what she was like or he was like, and this was my worst teacher. Okay, so having thought about that, let's talk really about what we think makes a good teacher and what we would have thought of historically. So for a long time in the 19th, 20th century, we thought, okay, maybe good teachers are born. You're just born a teacher, and this would be one of our ideas. You're good at doing certain things. You can tell people how to do things. You can instruct certain people. So for a long time, this was kind of the opinion that you were meant to be a teacher. And I think in some senses of the word, that's true. And then in the 60s and 70s, we began to think, well, maybe you're not just born a teacher, you learn certain methods to teach. So things like, do you develop the whole language approach to reading, or do you learn phonetically? And so we thought, okay, if you learn certain methodologies of teaching, that would be what would make you a good teacher. So now we begin to think, all right, so maybe you're born a teacher, you can get certain methods together, but maybe there are certain other things that you can do to make you a good teacher. So today I'm going to tell you some of these kind of ideas that might help you improve your teaching or your planning for instruction. So let's talk first about what I would call the PASS variables. That's P-A-S-S. Now this is an acronym, and so I'm going to just briefly outline the acronym for letting you think, okay, these are some things I could use to improve my teaching, and then I'm going to go through them more directly. So thinking about P, PASS, first of all, you need to prioritize your objectives, and I'm going to talk more about that. Then you may need to adapt your instruction. Maybe you're going to adapt the materials, the way in which you present things, and maybe you need to even adapt the environment. And then when we get to the S of PASS, P-A-S-S, we want you to systematically teach using some other kind of methods. So you need to have some structure to your class and your lesson. You need to present things clearly. You need sometimes to practice what we call redundancy. And this would be, you're going to repeat certain things, like learning your multiplication facts. So you learn those consistently until that method is redundant. Next, you need to teach with enthusiasm. And you might be surprised to learn that the most effective teachers are enthusiastic about their subject. They may not even always know so much about it, but they love their subject. They want you to be with them, and you catch that from them. So as a teacher, you need to absolutely love teaching, and you need to love your subject. Then, of course, you need to move at an appropriate rate, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes more. And then you'll be able to maximize the engagement of the students. And lastly, the last S on PASS, P-A-S-S, you need to systematically evaluate the outcomes. So in other words, you need to test what you've taught. Do your students know what you've taught them? Can they reproduce what you have taught them? So when you're prioritizing instruction, I want you to ask this question. What is the most important thing I want my students to come away from this lesson? You may have other smaller details, but what do you want everybody to know? And then you need to plan to cover the content. And there's a systematic way to do that as well. You need to base your instruction on the prioritized objective. That is the most important thing. Then you need to consider what we call scope and sequence. How deep you're going to go, or how broad you're going to cover something, and in what order you're going to cover something. So some lessons, some things that you want to teach are obviously sequential. You teach addition before you teach multiplication. You would teach all the steps in a process of equations before maybe you went on to calculus. Then there are other things that you can teach in isolation. So think about how broad, how deep, and how wide you want to teach something, and then also do you need to teach it in sequence. Then you need to select an appropriate curriculum. So in other words, you're not going to teach in the 12th grade what you teach in the first grade. They again may have gone in levels of understanding, but you're going to choose something appropriate for certain age ranges. And the last thing that you need to think about is the pace of instruction, how fast or how slow you're going. I'm sure we've all had teachers that wrote things on the board and then they erased it before we could copy it down. You give a big sigh, you think, why don't they know I'm not at that point already? And so you need to adjust your pace. And you may need to adjust that within your classroom as well. There are some students that are going to learn something much more quickly than other students, and you may need to reteach or pre-teach, give them a chance to learn something slightly beforehand before you actually present that particular topic to the class. So how do we write a good objective? A good objective should be both measurable and observable. So when you're writing an objective, if you say, I want my students to understand something, you have to ask yourself, is that a good verb in that sentence? If I have to ask the word how, so understand, how will I know they understand? You'll know that you haven't written a good objective. So an objective should be absolutely observable and measurable. So you're going to have 3 parts to your objective in the lesson. What is it you want them to learn? Secondly, under what conditions will they learn that particular thing? Who are they going to learn it with? When? Where are they going to demonstrate that to you? And lastly, what is the criteria for acceptable performance? How well do you want them to know a certain thing? And again, this might vary slightly with an age level. So let me give you 2 examples. This would be the example of a good objective. The student will independently write 5 causes for the American Civil War with 100% accuracy. I can observe them writing it. I can observe how well they write it with 100% accuracy. I can measure that. And I am telling you exactly what I want them to be able to do. Another example would be this. The student will accurately compute 50 3-digit addition problems after I have reviewed with them regrouping. So I know exactly what I want them to do. I can measure it and I can see them doing it. And I'm going to teach them or remind them a little bit about regrouping first of all. So that would make up a good objective. The other thing I want you to think about is the different levels that you have in your classroom. And we call this differentiation or individualization. It's common sense to think that people learn at different ways and in different rates. So I want you to think about that in your classroom. And there are 3 things here that you need to think about. The process, the content, and the product. How am I going to put this over for different students? Some students learn much better by looking at something, some learn by listening, some learn by doing. And so this would be, how am I going to put over the ideas? If I have a video, great. Am I going to draw something on the board? Am I going to let them listen to something? Am I going to use a book? Am I going to act something out? So this is what we call the process of putting over an idea. The next thing is the content. What information? This really relates back to the objective. And then I need to think, how complicated is it going to be? How simple is it going to be? And just exactly what I want them to understand, how much detail is going to be in the content of my idea. And then lastly, we call it the product. Some people call this the assessment piece. So this would be, what am I going to count back from the student that would demonstrate to me that they know something? And so it could be a quiz, it could be an essay, it could be a picture, it could be a poster. Maybe they could write a play. So that would be differentiating the product or the assessment that I do. And each student might respond differently in different ways, and some students are going to do better in some areas than they are in others. So when we adapt instruction, thinking back to our past variable, PASS, I want you to think about these things as well. Do any of your students have any physical limitations? Maybe they don't write as quickly as other students. Or maybe some people write extremely fast and they get everything done, and so that you know that that student's going to complete their work earlier. Do they have any sensory challenges? Maybe some students don't hear as well as others, or they don't see as well as others, or they pay attention better near the front of the classroom. So you need to think where you're going to sit your students and what kind of ways you're going to put over the information if they have any sensory deficits or difficulties. Then how well do they know the language? Maybe you're teaching in a second language, maybe English is their second language, or maybe French is their second language. So how well do they actually understand the language? How well can they read in that language? Can they understand you verbally? And also, can they write in that language? And then literacy, I've touched on this one really, but how well do they read? Again, if you're teaching in a second language, you need to consider the levels of reading in that classroom and how much you're teaching to those students based on reading. And last of all, emotional and behavioral differences. Some students are very shy. Some students are bold, and you know those students in your classroom. So I want you to adjust your instruction to those. Do you need to call on certain students because you know they'll never answer a question that you ask? The next thing I want to show you, and I know you'll be able to see this as well, just another way of structuring your ideas is what we call Bloom's taxonomy. So as you look at the pyramid there, I would like you just to think about including these different levels in your classroom instruction as well. The bottom one is knowledge. That's the very basic facts and details. Do they know dates of certain things that happened? Do they know colors if you're a preschool or kindergarten teacher? Do they know the difference between purple and blue? So that's the very basic thing. The next level in Bloom's is comprehension. Can they answer questions on a certain topic? When, where, why, how? Could they show you that they understood something? And the next level is being able to apply knowledge to different situations. This is what we call application. This is showing us that students know the facts, the details, they can answer comprehension questions, but then they can take that basic knowledge and apply it to new situations. The next level in Bloom's taxonomy is analysis. Could they look at a passage, say, and identify details? Could they pull it apart in some way and recognize there are different forms? There's different forms in a story. There's different forms in a poem. So could they actually analyze the material that you're teaching them? And then getting really higher up, what we want to see at the end of teaching in the K-12 setting, can they synthesize? Can they bring some ideas to form something new? So this is the creative part. Can they write a poem now? Can they write an essay with a lot of details? And last of all, evaluation. In the 12th grade and when they go on to university or college, can they make good judgments about this is a good piece of work or this is a sound idea? So I want you just to take that pyramid and think about, do I teach according to those levels? And obviously you're not going to teach every level in every grade level, but are you working towards that? Are you asking students to critically evaluate what they're learning in the last few years of school? I'm going to just show you now a lesson plan. And I'll go over this really quickly because I've covered a lot of the points. So when you look at the top of the lesson plan, you're going to probably put it within a general unit. So if you're teaching fractions, you know you're going to teach fractions with like denominators, then unlike denominators. You're going to teach addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. So that might be your unit. You're teaching fractions. Then you're going to teach a particular thing in the lesson. That's your title. Then you're going to write your lesson objective, and I've already referred to that. You might want to link that to a standard if you have standards that are written and prescribed for your particular country or your particular school. Then I'm going to just tell you about what would be the direct instruction model. First of all, the teacher is going to do something, you. So you're going to write down how you're going to show or demonstrate or tell, and so we call this teacher does. So the teacher is going to show or tell or demonstrate what you want them to learn in that particular lesson. Then you're going to go into some practice activities. And practice activities should be geared at the level the student is on. Not too easy and not too difficult. Some maybe just challenging a little bit. So we have two kinds of practice activities. We call it guided practice, where you and the students are going to still work on the idea together. Maybe you're going to call them to the blackboard and say, let's all work this problem together, or let's underline the verb in a sentence. And you'll have several volunteers and you'll ask the class, does this make sense? Is this correct? And you'll work on the idea together. And then you'll do independent practice. And generally this is the assessment activity. You're going to give them a quiz or a page of problems to work or a paragraph to write. You can say, now we've talked about this today, and so I want you to put it into practice. And so you can often use that for assessment. And then at the end, you should bring the lesson to a close. You should ask, what have we learned about today? Or you can summarize it yourself. Am I correct? Is this what we learned today? So you want to crystallize and sum up the ideas for the students at the end of the particular lesson. And I do have some examples of this. This is something perhaps you could easily make. This is a recall card, so the student can write some of the things that they've learned today. They could also say, this was the best part of the lesson for me, like this was my favorite part of the lesson. I really enjoyed being able to learn about another country, and they could put some details. And this is, what did I do in math class today? So you can make many, many of these, and we call these exit tickets. And again, this is a brief assessment and a brief measure for you that the students understand what you want them to know. So in conclusion, I have a slide now called Characteristics of Highly Engaging Teachers. And I want to ask you to go back to what you learned at the beginning, or what you wrote down at the beginning, what you discussed, what makes a good teacher or a bad teacher. And I would hazard a guess that you have written down the things that I have said today, or what I'm going to say in this last slide. I would think that you love teachers who knew their content. If they were a history teacher, they knew about the history that they were teaching you. If they were a chemistry teacher, they knew how to do experiments. You liked a teacher who knew their stuff. They knew their content. The next one says responsiveness to student needs. I'm sure that you loved your teacher who cared about you. They were willing to answer questions. They were willing to spend time with you. They were enthusiastic about what they taught. And then the next one says the socio-emotional climate of the classroom. That's, did the classroom feel good to you? Did you have friends in that classroom? Did the teacher create groups for you to be in? Did you just feel good when you went into that classroom, but not so good when you went into another classroom? And the last one, student autonomy. I would hazard a guess that you liked the teacher that gave you some independence, that let you select some of your ideas that you wanted to put into practice. And I would also hazard a guess that you're sitting there today because you had a teacher who taught you how to be independent and taught you to make autonomous decisions. So I want to thank you for listening to me today. I wish I could see you and talk to you, but I hope that you will take some of these ideas and put them into practice in your teaching. Thank you.